Hey guys, tonight we head back in time, way back, to when getting a date wasn't just complicated, it was practically a diplomatic mission. You find yourself standing in a stone courtyard beneath fluttering silk banners. The air smells faintly of animal fat from nearby torches, and the stiff, formal music of a lute drifts through the castle halls like everyone's trying not to have fun. Welcome to medieval dating, where your crush probably doesn't even know your name, and if they do, it's because your families negotiated a treaty over sheep. You probably won't survive this era with your dignity intact. Even a sideways glance could earn you a public scolding, and that's before the local priest weighs in on your sinful wrist touch. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time down in the comments so we know who's still awake with us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your stroll through medieval villages and city gates, brushing past market stalls and gossiping washerwomen. Forget romance novels. This is a world where marriage is mostly about economics, property, and your bloodline's credibility. Love is less fluttering hearts and more ledger balances. Your parents or guardians aren't just emotionally invested, they're literal negotiators of your future. In the 12th century, particularly in feudal Europe, marriages sealed alliances between families. You're not falling in love, you're cementing a land deal. Dowries, money or property the bride's family gave the groom were meticulously calculated. Your charm doesn't win you a match, your ability to provide goats does. The church loomed large over these arrangements. By the late Middle Ages, Christian doctrine made marriage a holy sacrament, but this didn't mean people got to choose freely. You might stand in a candlelit chapel, dressed in embroidered wool, reciting vows you barely understand, your new spouse watching you like one might watch a decent harvest. Romance, if it happened, was a side quest. Feelings took a backseat to lineage and financial stability. Peasants, too, had limited options, often marrying within their parish or village. Marrying outside your guild or social station? Bold move. Also illegal in some cases. You'd hear stories of so-called love matches, but most were whispered behind shuttered shutters. Eloping was a scandal, not a goal. Love could be tolerated if it didn't upset the social order. In wealthier circles, especially among nobility, a married couple might barely interact during courtship. Parents and clerics coordinated every aspect from astrological charts, yes, really, to witnessing proofs of virginity. Historians still argue whether these tests were symbolic, actual, or just invented later to spice up gossip. A fringe but fascinating tidbit, some families used urine analysis to predict fertility and compatibility. You don't get butterflies, you get a chamber pot and a physician sniffing your pee like it's a royal decree. Courtship manuals did exist, mostly for the clergy or upper class. They offered guidelines like not speaking to your beloved until you've consulted a friar. Sounds romantic, huh? Still, despite all the rigidity, tiny sparks did fly. Secret glances across the feast hall. A pressed flower dropped in your lap when nobody's looking. A touch lingered, half a breath too long, while passing parchment in Latin class. A rare but documented escape route, the monastery. Some young nobles, especially women, chose the religious life to avoid forced marriages. Sure, you'd swap a bad match for celibacy and embroidered manuscripts, but hey, you'd keep your autonomy. And here's something you didn't expect. Being single wasn't always pitied. Widows, as you'll discover soon, could wield surprising freedom. But right now, you're still wading through a culture where falling in love is considered reckless behavior. So, as you tuck yourself deeper into this medieval nightscape, remember, your heart has very little say here. Romance was a luxury, not a right, and often came with consequences.
You drift down the candlelit corridors of medieval courtship where even ribbons are scandalous. You're not just watching romance unfold, you're deciphering secret codes passed through fabric, trinkets, and gestures that could get someone flogged or married, or both. Welcome to the world of symbolic wooing, where speaking your heart out loud is basically emotional streaking. You spot a young man, his velvet tunic just a touch too fancy, his beard quivering with hope, offering a token to a lady whose wimple barely reveals her eyebrows. It's a simple braid of silk, but to them, it's louder than 1,000 love songs. These objects, rings, handkerchiefs, even flowers, aren't just pretty. They speak for the lovers who aren't allowed to speak for themselves. One popular gift? A girdle. No, not the medieval shapewear, though that's a different rabbit hole. A decorative belt offered to a lover symbolized fidelity, passion, and, let's be honest, a subtle reminder not to flirt with Sir Geoffrey during jousting week. The fringe tidbit here, some girdles had secret pockets for pressed herbs said to enhance romantic success. Medieval aromatherapy, anyone? But it's not all sweet. Some exchanges were more tactical than tender. A knight might wear a lady's token, a scarf or sleeve fragment, on his armor during tournaments. It wasn't just sentiment, it was branding. This sword swing is brought to you by Lady Edith's questionable choices. Courtly love, after all, was more performance than reality. Historians still argue whether these traditions reflect genuine emotion or ritualized status games. Was that poem about aching hearts or aching land deals? Hard to tell when everyone's rhyming thou with plow. Sometimes the symbolism got even weirder. In certain regions, exchanging shoes signified acceptance of a marriage proposal. You give your crush a sandal, they don't throw it at your face, wedding bells incoming. Church supervision ensured that these interactions stayed pure. That meant no unsupervised walks, no love letters without clerical review, and certainly no hand-holding unless someone was dying. The church loved symbolism too. Rings were often blessed, and betrothal ceremonies resembled mini weddings, even if nobody involved was remotely ready. Of course, there's the awkward dance of eye contact across banquet halls. You look, then look away, then again. Did they smile? Or are they just plotting your family's downfall? In medieval romance, it's a fine line. Even within villages, these token exchanges could get spicy. At seasonal festivals, young people played games with flowers and fruit that flirted without saying a word. One game involved pairing apples with hidden notes dropped off in haylofts. If you think texting is nerve-wracking, try sneaking fruit into someone's barn without their father catching you. Then there's the darker side. A token declined could spark feuds. Families might bicker over perceived slights. He returned the handkerchief? We'll siege their garden. Still, despite the drama, these tokens gave people a way to express themselves in a society obsessed with silence and control. You could whisper through a ribbon what you couldn't say out loud. You could tuck hope into a glove and pray it reached the right hands. So, as you wander through this world, note the small exchanges. A ribbon knotted a certain way, a handkerchief worn across the shoulder instead of around the neck. These were acts of rebellion wrapped in sentiment, quiet declarations of "I see you" amid the thundering dictates of church bells and family duty. And when your heart stirs at the glint of a brooch or the scent of pressed lavender in a pouch, remember, you're not imagining romance. You're just fluent in medieval metaphor.
You've got your ribbon. Your sandal exchange went surprisingly well, and now you're perched halfway up a stone balcony like an overworked messenger pigeon. Welcome to the world of courtly love, a grand performance of romantic longing with rules more rigid than a knight's codpiece. Imagine you're a knight, fresh from polishing your armor and probably your ego, composing elaborate poems about a lady who's way out of your league. She's noble, married, and completely unattainable, which is kind of the whole point. In this medieval drama, love isn't meant to be fulfilled. It's meant to inspire you to fight better, write worse poetry, and definitely not act on your feelings. You're pouring your soul into parchment, describing eyes like moons, lips like roses, and feet like, well, hopefully not turnips. You slip the scroll to a page who risks their life smuggling it across castle courtyards. The lady might read it, or toss it, or frame it next to a tax ledger. Historians still argue whether these passionate declarations were ever intended to lead to real relationships. Was it theater? Flattery? A passive-aggressive critique of arranged marriages? Regardless, you could be banished, or worse, if caught sneaking sonnets. A mainstream fact to anchor this romantic chaos. The concept of courtly love gained traction in 12th century France and was popularized by troubadours. These wandering musicians were the rock stars of their time, wooing with lyrical drama and occasionally flutes. The church wasn't thrilled. They preferred marriage to be about duty, not desire. Lust was considered a dangerous beast, and loving someone who wasn't your spouse, even abstractly, made theologians sweat through their robes. Still, some royals played along. Eleanor of Aquitaine famously promoted courtly love in her courts, fostering a culture where romantic admiration could flourish, within reason. As in, you could admire her, but don't start knocking on her window with a lute. Fringe tidbit? There were actual love courts held in noble circles where women judged men's romantic behavior. They debated whether a gesture was truly loving or just mildly pathetic. Imagine being publicly evaluated for your emotional subtlety in front of a panel of ladies with very sharp fans. And here's your dilemma. If you're caught pining too loudly, you could be accused of dishonoring the lady. But if you're too subtle, you might be misunderstood for admiring her embroidery. There's no winning, only sighing. Even commoners got in on the action occasionally, imitating noble styles of flirtation through songs and folk tales. These stories often featured exaggerated love quests involving tests of loyalty, hidden letters, and one heroic mule. Yet for all its flourish, courtly love remained a fantasy, a coping mechanism in a society where love and marriage were rarely aligned. You're playing a game with no prize, except maybe spiritual purity or chronic loneliness. So, as you lean against that balcony under the night sky, whispering sonnets to a silhouette who probably thinks you're the gardener. Remember, in medieval love, the chase mattered more than the catch. And if your poem gets returned with a doodle instead of a reply, count yourself lucky. At least it wasn't a shoe.
You wake up to clanging bells and realize today's the day you learn what compatibility meant in medieval matchmaking. And it's not your taste in music or how well you both do in group projects. No, here, your parents, priests, and neighborhood astrologer are holding a conference call about your romantic fate. You shuffle down a dirt path past village chapels and manor houses where families aren't just recommending potential matches, they're steering your entire relationship like it's a merchant ship packed with sheep, spices, and future regrets. Marriage negotiations were more thorough than most peace treaties. You're not wondering, do I love them? You're wondering, what phase was Mars in when they were born? In medieval Europe, astrology wasn't a quirk. It was serious business. Compatibility could be decided by star charts. If Venus was in retrograde during your intended's birth, well, maybe marry someone with more favorable lunar vibes. Historians still argue whether astrology was more guiding principle or post-failure excuse-making, but scrolls of horoscopes were often consulted alongside ledgers and family crests. You overhear your parents listing traits like lineage purity and dowry value, not exactly the stuff of Tinder bios. Your family chooses your future with an eye toward alliances and stability, not personality compatibility. Imagine your dad rejecting a suitor because their uncle once lost a duel to your cousin's horse. There's a fringe tidbit for you. In parts of medieval Italy, palm reading was occasionally used to evaluate a potential partner's trustworthiness. If your lifeline curved a certain way, it meant you'd make a loyal spouse or a professional tax evader. Church officials weighed in heavily, too. Marriages required religious approval, and you couldn't marry a close cousin unless given a dispensation. That close part got murky since nobles basically passed around 3 last names. This led to convoluted documents where your lineage looked more like a medieval tangle of yarn. You're trudging through this world trying not to trip over your own expectations. Maybe you've romanticized courtship a little too much. One glance at the bride's worried expression and groom's twitching collar tells you this union isn't about feelings. It's about forging dynastic power and not dying poor. So you attend the church ceremony where families beam with pride and nobody makes eye contact. Rings are exchanged, the priest blesses the union, you hear whispers about the couple's birth charts as incense curls toward the rafters. And somewhere outside, a troubadour sings a lament about doomed passion and boiled cabbage. Even for peasants, family approval remained crucial. Marriage without it risked alienation, banishment, or exile to an extremely uneventful farm. In smaller communities, matchmaking was everyone's business. You didn't just marry the person, you married their debt, their pig habits, and their mother's unrelenting side-eye. Still, not everyone followed the script. Secret relationships bloomed despite rigid systems. But if you got caught marrying outside your prescribed status, the consequences could be dire. A fine, prison, or relocation to somewhere with significantly fewer pies. Now you duck into a tavern, watching young villagers gossiping about who's getting paired next. They laugh, but their smiles are thin. You sip warm ale and wonder how you'd fare in a world where your heart's compass has to compete with your family's ledger. As the tavern dims and stars prick the sky outside, remember, back then, your destiny wasn't carved by dreams or chemistry. It was inked by relatives wielding parchments and celestial charts. You didn't fall in love. You landed in it after your uncle read your future in goat entrails.
You hide behind a tapestry, literally. Tonight, you're on the run with two young nobles who've decided that forbidden love beats life with a stranger who smells like boiled onions and speaks in contracts. It's risky, scandalous, and completely medieval. Welcome to the high-stakes drama of elopement. They've slipped out after dusk, their boots muffled with cloth, a few coins and a stolen horse between them. You follow, heart pounding, knowing that what they're doing isn't romantic. It's a potential death sentence. For nobles, defying family and church wasn't rebellion. It was near treason. In this society, love wasn't private. Your affection was a matter of family honor, social structure, and land rights. Elopement challenged all three. Historians still argue whether such escapes were acts of passion or desperation. Was it love, or just the last loophole in a life scripted by others? Mainstream fact: elopement in medieval Europe was rare but not unheard of. Canon law required free consent between spouses, so technically you could marry in secret with verbal vows alone. But good luck arguing theology while the town guard chases you down with a halberd. The most famous elopers often became cautionary tales. Think lovers forced into exile, stripped of titles, or hunted down by furious fathers who hadn't authorized even so much as a hand kiss. Fringe tidbit? In some rural communities, couples would elope to boundary stones. Yes, actual rocks, believed to hold spiritual significance. They'd exchange vows with nature as their only witness, assuming that moss had better judgment than most priests. You watch these lovers navigate moonlit forests, gripping each other's hands with the kind of hope that makes even sleeping in pig sheds romantic. They've no priest, no witnesses, only trust, and possibly a rendezvous with a sympathetic friar if they survive till dawn. Meanwhile, back at the castle, family honor burns like candle wax. Parents dispatch letters, blame curses, consult astrologers. Servants gossip about scandal, while bards start composing tragic ballads before the inks dry. And if they're caught, punishments vary. A stint in a convent, a forced annulment, public shaming involving literal stocks, or worse, your ex delivering sermons about betrayal. You don't just lose love, you lose reputation and standing. Yet some elopements did succeed. A lucky few forged new lives in distant towns, adopting fake names, building cottages, raising families where nobody cared who your great-great-uncle jousted. You'd live on bread, secrets, and stolen time. Even peasants faced backlash. Eloping across village lines without permission could lead to fines, beatings, or being forcibly returned in a cart filled with manure for added drama. Still, the dream of love unfiltered pushed many to risk everything. You pause in a quiet glade, watching the fugitives rest beneath an ash tree. It's here you understand love, real love, was rare in this world not just because of rules, but because breaking them demanded more courage than most possessed. So the next time you think your relationship's complicated, remember, At least you're not relying on bark rituals and praying the guards are nearsighted. Medieval love was often muted, supervised, and suffocating. But every now and then, a scandal slipped through the gates and galloped toward freedom.
You're walking through a village where the wedding banners have faded, the feast scraps are gone, and one woman sits alone by the hearth, her veil traded for a sturdy cloak. Meet the widow. Not a tragedy, but a plot twist. In a world of forced vows and rigid matchmaking, widowhood was one of the few paths to personal agency. Strange, right? You have to lose a husband to gain your own voice. She stirs a pot of stew, her fingers adorned with rings she didn't remove, not just memories, but badges of survival. In medieval Europe, widowhood wasn't just about mourning. It opened a door most women never got to touch in youth, the right to choose again, or not choose at all. Widows were legally distinct. You could own property, conduct business, even decline future proposals with something resembling social safety. Depending on your status, you might remarry strategically, stay single by choice, or become a patron of local affairs with more authority than your brother-in-law ever dreamed of. Historians still argue whether this autonomy was widespread or limited to elite classes, but either way, it made the widow a wild card. A mainstream fact, canon law emphasized a widow's freedom to remarry without requiring family consent, unlike virginal brides. The church valued chastity but respected the sanctity of grief and personal discernment. Translation: no one could legally force her into another marriage. Social pressure, yes. Legal obligation, nope. You watch her walk into the market, selling goods she produced herself. She's not begging, she's bartering. She could even serve as a witness in court, a rarity for most women. Her name might show up in tax rolls and civic petitions. You realize she's visible in a way married women aren't. She occupies a social role that carries both caution and curiosity. Fringe tidbit: in some regions, widows hosted matchmaking gatherings for others. Who better to guide young lovers than someone who's survived the system and come out with both stories and receipts? Still, being a widow wasn't all empowerment. Depending on circumstances, she might struggle with inheritance claims, fend off greedy in-laws, or battle stigma if her husband's death seemed even slightly suspicious. Too many herbs in his porridge, and suddenly she's dodging witch trials. Yet some women transformed widowhood into reinvention. They opened businesses, ran estates, or led pilgrimages. One notable example, Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic who, post-widowhood, became a renowned religious figure and dictated one of the earliest autobiographies in English. And here's a delicate irony. The very death that stripped her of societal protection also unlocked social maneuverability. It's a tragic math, loss giving way to latitude. You're reminded that sometimes survival isn't just endurance, it's negotiation with fate. As twilight folds in, you watch her light a candle by her window. There's no lover in sight, no priest hovering with a scroll. Just her silhouette against the stone wall, strong and centered.
The world may still see her through the lens of grief, but she's already sketching something new. In medieval dating customs, she stands apart. She's no naive bride, no star-crossed eloper. She's postscript, rewriting her role, choosing who enters her story next, if anyone at all.
You squint against the desert sun and find yourself astride a shaggy steppe pony surrounded by warriors whose armor glints beneath the vast sky. You're part of an army led not by a king, but by a queen, Tomius of the Massagetæ. The wind carries her battle cry across the plains, and suddenly you realize this isn't just history, it's a reckoning. Tomius isn't a name you'd expect to find carved in stone beside conquerors and emperors, but her legacy ripples across centuries. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, credits her with one of the most spectacular victories in pre-classical warfare, defeating Cyrus the Great of Persia in the 6th century BCE. That's not a small feat. Cyrus was basically the empire builder's empire builder, and she ended him. You watch her sharpen a blade beside a tent made of felt and hide. She isn't mourning, she's calculating. Cyrus had killed her son, either in battle or through treachery, sources vary, and her retaliation wasn't a footnote, it was a cataclysm. Mainstream fact, the Massagetæ were a nomadic confederation living in Central Asia, known for their fierce independence and equestrian warfare. They moved with the seasons, fought in coordinated swarms, and worshipped the sun. Their lifestyle baffled sedentary empires who couldn't imagine not building cities or walls. Tomius gathered her warriors not by decrees, but by grief and loyalty. She promised vengeance, and her people answered. The showdown with Cyrus occurred near the Sir Darya River, where traps and ambushes turned into full-scale slaughter. According to Herodotus, she personally decapitated Cyrus and dunked his head in a bag of blood. Was it literal? Symbolic? Historians still argue whether it's true or just Greek poetic justice. Fringe tidbit: some accounts suggest the Massagetæ practiced ritual cannabis inhalation before battle, an early form of pre-war meditation or spiritual preparation. You inhale the smoky air and feel a dizzying mix of clarity and chaos. Tomius wasn't just a ruler, she was a cultural node. Her story echoes across archaeological fragments, nomadic legends, and modern feminist retellings. She's invoked not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of maternal rage turned into strategic brilliance. You ride beside her scouts, watching them navigate terrain with an instinct that borders on supernatural. No maps, just memory, wind direction, and ancestral rhythm. Her people don't fight for borders. They fight for motion, legacy, and vengeance etched into saddle leather. You realize she's leading not just a battle, but a resistance against empire logic. No cities, no bureaucrats, just fast horses, flexible tactics, and stories that travel faster than scrolls. And as the dust settles on Cyrus's demise, you sense something haunting. Tomius didn't seek glory, she demanded justice. Her war wasn't about expansion, it was about honor, and that made her terrifying. So,
As you drift through this ancient steppe night, watching her silhouette framed by stars, you understand power isn't just about conquest. Sometimes it's the silence after revenge, the calm in the storm, the queen who rides ahead not to be admired, but to be followed.
You're trotting across the open steppes now, the sky stretched like a tapestry above, your feet wrapped in leather and wool, your tent folded neatly behind your saddle. Welcome to the Masajetai's world, a nomadic people who laugh at castles, outrun kingdoms, and sleep wherever the horizon kisses the ground. Unlike their city-dwelling neighbors, these nomads don't need stone walls or towering gates. Their strength lies in motion. You live where the grazing's good, where rivers run clear, and where you can pack up and move before anyone's politics reach your doorstep. Home isn't a building, it's a direction. You pass a circle of tents, tight-knit like a family gathering. Smoke curls from central fires. Elders tell stories, not just to entertain, but to preserve knowledge. Oral tradition rules here. Scrolls are luxuries, but memory is sacred. Every tale passed along contains genealogy, survival tips, and probably a cautionary tale involving goats. Mainstream fact: nomadic cultures like the Masajetai were common across Eurasia, from the Scythians to the Mongols, and shaped trade routes, warfare, and even culinary traditions. They spread technologies, beliefs, and fabrics across continents like winds carrying secrets. But historians still argue whether their mobility meant chaos or innovation. Sedentary empires saw them as unpredictable threats, while nomads saw empires as slow-moving targets with too many bells. You settle onto a woven rug and sip fermented mare's milk, an acquired taste that says we don't do room service. Everything around you is engineered for portability. Homes, tools, rituals. Nothing weighs too much, not even grief. A fringe tidbit? Some Central Asian nomadic tribes believed that mountains were sleeping giants and used singing bowls to wake certain peaks before major journeys. You hum softly, feeling vibrations buzz through the air. Women play prominent roles. You watch them wrangle livestock, lead ceremonies, and debate clan matters with the same authority as any male elder. The queen you rode with, Tamias, was no exception. Her leadership wasn't an anomaly. It was tradition honored by ancestors whose names are sung, not written. Their spirituality ties closely to nature. The sun is sacred, winds hold messages, and the stars? Ancient guides. Shamans read animal behavior and cloud formations with the reverent city scholars reserve for books. You begin to suspect nature knows more than most libraries. No one demands allegiance to a flag. Loyalty belongs to kin, shared memory, and the ever-shifting geography. You fight not for empire, but for freedom of movement, for food security, for firewood when it matters most. As dusk spills like ink across the plains, you listen to night songs echoing through the valleys. There's no loneliness here, just space and stories, and the sound of hoofs tapping the earth like a heartbeat. So, if you're still trying to figure out why these people never built castles, remember they didn't need walls when they had wind, stars, and wheels. What they built instead: culture, connection, and legacy,
moves faster than stone ever could.
The fire crackles low beside you. Its glow painting bronze flickers across warriors' cheekbones and the bone-carved amulets stitched into their leather coats. Tonight, you sit cross-legged with the nomads, not just any nomads, but the women who rule, fight, and heal. You've met queens, now you meet commanders, mystics, and horse archers, whose legacy lives not in books, but in breath and blood. You're handed a carved cup of kumis again. Yep, still fermented mare's milk, while a young woman sharpens her blade nearby. She's barely 20, but already carries stories inked into her arms, each tattoo marking a battle, a victory, or a loss. Around the fire, no one doubts her place. She's not a sidekick, she's an equal, maybe a leader. Mainstream fact: across Central Asia's nomadic societies, including the Massagetes, Scythians, and later Mongols, women held prominent roles as warriors, priestesses, clan leaders, and negotiators. They weren't just present, they were essential. Archaeological evidence shows female graves with weapons, horse tack, and signs of high status. These weren't symbolic inclusions, they were lived identities. One fierce example? Excavations in southern Siberia uncovered skeletons of female warriors buried with bows and arrows, sometimes even war injuries. Historians still argue whether this indicated a formal rank system for women or informal equality through capability. Whatever the case, these warriors weren't exceptions, they were expected. Fringe tidbit? Certain nomadic traditions held that women born during thunderstorms were destined to be shamans. You glance at the elder beside you, silver braids, fur-lined cloak, who commands the circle with nothing but silence and a feather. She doesn't shout, she hums. The fire obeys. You lean back as stories begin. In these oral traditions, female figures emerge as architects of fate. A grandmother who saved a herd from plague by reciting wind poems. A sister who rode into battle carrying the ashes of her first love, then won. And here's the kicker. None of them proved themselves. They weren't climbing ladders meant for men. They followed trails cut by ancestors whose names ripple through the air like starlight. You pass through a story song where women tame falcons and recite ancestral names back 10 generations. These aren't myths, they're maps. You realize that in nomadic culture, memory is power, and those who preserve it are more influential than any sword swinger. Even spiritual leadership tilted toward women. Female shamans were common, often serving as healers, dream interpreters, and ritual leaders. They knew the plants, the stars, and the winds. Their tents were lined with bones, herbs, and bells that rang only when the veil between worlds grew thin. You watch them now, an older woman tracing symbols in ash, a younger one practicing her war cry with birdsong accompaniment. No one dismisses them, no one laughs. Here, femininity isn't dainty, it's elemental. There's laughter, too. Not delicate giggles, but full-throated, fire-cracked joy.
A tale about a warrior woman who once tricked a general into surrendering by dressing as a ghost and chanting insults in 6 languages. The younger girls listen wide-eyed, half scared, half thrilled. These women don't just lead, they embody heritage. Their strength is not just martial, but maternal, emotional, spiritual. They fight wars, raise children, shape laws, and sing lullabies in languages the empires forgot. And as you drift off beside the fire, your final image isn't steel or blood. It's a circle of women under endless sky, telling stories that no scroll could hold, casting spells with memory and courage, carrying lineages with every hoofbeat. This is where history breathes, not in monuments, but in songs, scars, and the quiet thunder of women who lead and bleed.
You're perched on a ridge overlooking a vast, trembling plain where the air itself seems to hum with tension. Below, a sedentary empire stands bewildered, scribbling reports about nomads who appear and vanish like smoke. You're riding with the wind, dodging assumptions, listening to stories that no official ever bothered to record. This is the space between misunderstanding and myth, where nomads and empires talk past each other while history spins on regardless. You gallop with messengers who pass oral news faster than letters. No ink, no delay, just memory and muscle. The Massagetai, Scythians, and later nomads all face the same branding: unpredictable, uncivilized, even barbaric. To sedentary societies ruled by bureaucracy and brick, mobility looks like chaos, but to you, it looks like freedom. Mainstream fact: Roman, Persian, and Chinese empires often described nomadic tribes as threats, painting them with broad strokes of savagery. In truth, these mobile cultures possessed intricate codes of honor, diplomacy, and trade. They weren't lawless, they just had different laws, ones written into behavior, not scrolls. Empires didn't get it. Nomads didn't build temples with gold. They hung devotion in the wind. They didn't record taxes. They gifted respect through ritual. To empire scholars, this was suspiciously poetic. You find it breathtaking. Historians still argue whether the empire-nomad tension was purely political or rooted in cultural bias. Were the nomads genuine threats or just misunderstood stewards of stories that couldn't be archived? You sit beneath a tree that grew from a shepherd's abandoned staff, listening to 2 elders debate the details of a war from 80 winters ago. They don't agree, but their disagreement is half the point. Consensus isn't sacred. Conversation is. Fringe tidbit: some nomadic clans trained parrots to mimic traders' voices, using them to simulate negotiations. You hear a squawk near the tent and wonder if someone's pretending to haggle with a bird again. You ride through borderlands where misunderstandings pile like autumn leaves. A general sees horsemen and prepares for war. A trader sees the same riders and prepares a feast. You see nuance. Too bad nuance doesn't build fortresses.
Even nomadic burial rites confuse empire scouts. Some practice sky burials, leaving the body to birds, releasing the soul to air. Empire priests clutch their scrolls in horror. You recognize reverence in the silence between feathers. Language itself becomes a battlefield. Empire tongues demand clarity. Nomadic tongues revel in metaphor. The river watches means it might flood soon. She rides with thunder means do not insult her tea. You realize that translation is more than words, it's worldview. Trade happens in whispered gestures. A single bead passed from saddle to hand might signal agreement. No paperwork, no contracts, just trust passed through bone-handled daggers and fire-stained cloaks. And yet, despite all this distance, cultures blend. Silk travels west, stories travel east. You hear a Persian myth retold with Mongol flair. You taste Chinese tea brewed in a Scythian pot. No one signs treaties, but everyone shares soup. By the time you return to camp, the empire has sent messengers. They ask for tribute, maps, maybe even peace. The elders listen. They nod. They gift horses and riddles. Empires leave satisfied, none the wiser. So when you next hear a history book declare the nomads were defeated, squint a little harder. They weren't conquered. They just moved on.
You're knee-deep in gravel, elbowing rocks aside, squinting into a blinding dust storm that smells faintly of dynamite and pipe tobacco. Welcome to the construction of the American Transcontinental Railroad, a project so ambitious it sliced a continent in two and stitched it back together with iron. The year is somewhere between 1863 and 1869. War is raging in the East, but here progress is measured in track miles and broken bones. You join a group of Chinese laborers scaling a jagged Sierra Nevada ridge with pickaxes and baskets. No gloves, no safety gear. Just grit, tradition, and maybe a little homesick humming. Mainstream fact: the Transcontinental Railroad united the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads, creating a continuous link from California to Nebraska and eventually to the East Coast. It revolutionized transportation, shrinking cross-country travel from months to mere days. But that shine comes with shadows. Thousands of laborers, Chinese immigrants on the western half, Irish immigrants and freedmen on the eastern half, faced brutal conditions. You feel the sweat stinging your eyes before sunrise. You're paid less, housed in tents barely holding together, and treated like living tools. Historians still argue whether the railroad's labor legacy was underappreciated or deliberately buried beneath patriotic storytelling. The workers built an empire, but their names rarely made the maps. And here's your fringe tidbit. Dynamite wasn't used until the later stages. Early blasts relied on black powder packed into crevices like medieval siege tactics. You watch a group of workers light a fuse, run like banshees, and celebrate when the mountain gives way with a grunt, not a roar.
At lunchtime, you share rice and bitter tea. There's laughter, but always with one eye on the foreman. A man nearby talks about ghosts, how the mountains claim souls without notice. You wonder how many spirits linger in the tunnels, unseen but whispering through the timber. Further east, Irish crews fight prairie heat and boredom. Their challenge isn't cliffs, it's endless flat land. You join a prac gang pushing rails in rhythmic curses and jokes. The sun is unforgiving. The bosses, even worse. And now you glimpse the bigger cost. Native tribes watch this iron snake eat their land. You hear drumming in the distance, not celebration, but warning. The railroad is more than metal, it's invasion. Sacred sites get plowed, buffalo vanish. You realize this project doesn't just build, it erases. Despite everything, progress barrels forward. Locomotives hiss, ties thud into place. Mountains get carved like loaves of bread. It's awe-inspiring and tragic, a contradiction on wheels. By nightfall, you huddle near a campfire with men too tired to speak. Someone hums a Cantonese lullaby, another whistles an Irish folk tune. Cultures overlap in sweat and sparks. And though no one's calling this a dream job, every spike driven into the soil makes a sound that will echo for generations. So, as the stars blink above the ragged camps, you understand this railroad isn't just transportation, it's transformation. It's suffering wrapped in steel and ambition. It's a track laid across hearts, hopes, and histories.
You're clinging to the edge of a cliff, surrounded by thunderous silence, broken only by the occasional distant blast and shouted curse. This is the Sierra Nevada range, a granite nightmare full of switchbacks, snow, and stone that doesn't care if your hands are bleeding. You were building the impossible. The Central Pacific crews, mostly Chinese laborers, face challenges few others would survive. Mountains don't negotiate, they mock you. You chip at boulders for hours only to reveal more rock. The air is thin, the snow deep, and you're sleeping in tents that flutter like broken kites. One slip of the boot means a fall so epic you'd be remembered only as that one guy who dropped a hammer mid-scream. Mainstream fact. In order to cross the Sierra Nevadas, workers carved more than 15 tunnels through solid granite using black powder and hand tools. These tunnels were engineering feats, but also scenes of despair. Workers hung from ropes to dig into sheer rock faces with hammers and chisels. Historians still argue whether the bravery of these crews was ever properly acknowledged. Only recently have their names begun appearing in plaques and curriculum. Before that, silence, except from the cliffs they carved. Further east, you ride through Utah's desert heat, where the Union Pacific lays track at breakneck speed. The terrain isn't jagged, but deceptive. Long stretches of arid land that boil your brain by noon and freeze your bones by nightfall. There's dust in every meal, every ear canal, every complaint. Fringe tidbit:
Some crews swore the Great Basin had ghosts, whispers carried on wind, shadows at noon. A few refused to work certain stretches after spotting dancing lights with no flame. You laugh nervously, then stop when the wind hums your name. You meet freedmen hauling rail across endless sand. They're proud but tired, former slaves building something they were once excluded from. The irony sits heavy like the rails they haul. You talk over dried cornbread and stories passed down from Georgia and Missouri, and you realize this job is more than labor, it's legacy. Time means little out here. A missed day could mean derailing schedules, losing supplies, or failing a quota. Supervisors bark like generals. Every inch of track is both a triumph and a threat. Speed matters. Accuracy matters. Lives? Less so. A traveling tent preacher visits one camp, declaring the railroad a miracle on earth. 5 workers nod. 10 laugh. 1 weeps softly. The preacher moves on. And there's always dynamite now. Boom, echo, dust. Repeat. You watch a crew set a charge, eyes steady, fingers practiced. They count, brace, and run. The blast opens a new tunnel like a jagged mouth. You don't cheer, you cough. At twilight, you stumble across a graveyard with no markers, just worn earth and broken boots half buried. These aren't memorials, they're confessions. You whisper thanks, not knowing the names, hoping someone else once did. And as the stars reappear in this unforgiving wilderness, you see the railroad not as progress, but as a scar. Beautiful, brutal, earned. The mountain might have cracked, but so did countless hearts.
You step aboard a locomotive, clutching a leather satchel and blinking against the sun. For the first time, you can cross the continent in a matter of days, not months, rattling through valleys, deserts, and snow-draped peaks, all thanks to the shimmering iron veins of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is more than a train ride. It's transformation with a ticket stub. The completion date, May 10, 1869, is etched into history, when the Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines met at Promontory Summit, Utah. The ceremonial golden spike wasn't just symbolic. It rang out the start of a new national identity. You weren't just traveling. You were participating in a redefinition of space and time. Mainstream fact, before the railroad, cross-country travel took upward of 6 months via wagon trails, risking disease, starvation, and the occasional very poorly timed snowstorm. Afterward, you could go coast to coast in under a week. It revolutionized migration, commerce, and military strategy. Now you race past landscapes once considered remote, untamed. The West, with all its mythos, shrinks against the rhythm of steel. You sip coffee in Nevada and send telegrams from Wyoming. Suddenly, time zones are a thing. Railroads demanded synchronized clocks and gave rise to the idea of standard time. Historians still argue whether the railroad created modernity or simply accelerated it. Along the route, you see thriving towns spring up like mushrooms after rain.
Dodge City, Cheyenne, Reno, cities born from rail and dust. You also pass ghost towns, once full of hammer swings and ambition, now empty but for tumbleweeds and half-sunk boots. Fringe tidbit? Some early travelers swore by railroad face tonics, liquid concoctions sold at stations to moisturize your skin after long rides. Ingredients included rose water, witch hazel, and suspicious amounts of alcohol. You try one and smell like an elegant skunk for the rest of the journey. You meet families moving west, immigrants chasing land, fortune seekers chasing silver, and freedmen chasing safety. The railroad made it possible. It opened doors once bolted shut by geography and fear. But the speed carries shadows. You pass by native lands carved by iron teeth. Buffalo scatter, sacred grounds erode, and reservations expand under duress. Progress, you realize, always charges rent, and the receipts are written in blood and silence. On board, cultures collide. You sit beside a banker, a miner, a preacher, and a woman writing letters in Yiddish. Everyone's heading somewhere, but nobody's arrived yet. It's a mobile crossroads, an echo of stagecoaches now replaced by steam and steel. You glimpse headlines promising unity and prosperity. "The nation is joined," shouts one paper. But below the fold, tales of missing workers, lawsuits over land, and communities left to navigate rapid change without maps. And as the train chugs beneath a rising moon, you feel it, that thrum in your chest matching the rails. This journey isn't just movement, it's momentum. You're part of something vast, contradictory, and unstoppable. So as the wheels click toward destiny, you know this ride reshaped the American spirit, not by smoothing terrain, but by proving the country could bend stone, wood, and will into one shared journey.
You walk along the tracks now, boots scuffing iron gravel as wind whistles through brittle grass. The gleaming rails that once symbolized ambition now echo with the quiet reminders of lives consumed. Tonight, you hear whispers, not from the train, but from beneath it. Welcome to the shadow side of progress, where dreams are buried deep beneath polished steel. The Transcontinental Railroad didn't just reshape geography, it reshaped humanity. As the train stretched westward, so did its appetite. Native American tribes faced relentless displacement. Their homelands became buffer zones. Sacred burial sites were bulldozed. Buffalo herds, a cornerstone of life, were driven to near extinction. And with each passing locomotive, the horizon closed in on people who had always lived with it wide open. Mainstream fact, the railroad carved across lands guaranteed to tribes by previous treaties, violating agreements with impunity. Military outposts followed, enforcing control. Some communities were forcibly relocated, others vanished, consumed by the rail's forward motion. You wander an abandoned encampment, dry earth, broken pottery, and rusting tools left as if the owners would return, but they won't. Historians still argue whether this devastation was collateral or intentional. Manifest destiny made no room for pause. Workers, too, bore the cost. Chinese laborers were often denied citizenship and faced violent backlash in towns they helped build. Freedmen found employment,
but no equality. Irish immigrants endured stereotyping and job instability. Everyone sweat, not everyone reaped. You read a newspaper headline, "The West is won," but the subtext, invisible in ink, screams, "The loss is immeasurable." The prairie doesn't sing anymore. It sighs. Fringe tidbit? Some stations began collecting railway relics, worn hammers, bent spikes, abandoned boots, to display as triumph symbols. But beneath glass, the tragedy glimmers louder. A museum of forgotten effort. You sit on an old rail, running your fingers along the grooves worn by decades of trains. A carved name catches your eye. Just initials, probably scratched by a homesick worker. You imagine the story behind it, one of thousands lost in steam and soot. Commerce surged, banks boomed, postal routes streamlined, but for every mile gained, entire cultures were erased from maps. Dreams weren't always fulfilled. Some were stolen. Some were traded for survival. Others just never left the tracks. And now, as the stars sharpen overhead, you feel the rumble of an oncoming train, a reminder that history rolls on, regardless of who it leaves behind. These rails carried ambition, sorrow, and sacrifice. They still do. So next time you board a train and watch the land blur past your window, remember, beneath those rails lie stories. Some are never told, others never stop whispering.
You're back on the railway. Boots echoing against old iron as the landscape slips into twilight. The trains aren't rushing now. They're whispering. Every rail hums like a stringed instrument tuned to memory. You walk slowly, letting the rhythm seep into your bones. This is the final stretch, where progress meets peace, or tries to. The Transcontinental Railroad changed America. It linked oceans, ideas, and futures in steel and steam. It fueled dreams and industries, ushered in cities, mail, and migration. But now, as night folds around you, you hear more than movement. You hear reflection. Mainstream fact. Even today, sections of the original railroad remain active, preserved, or memorialized. Some towns exist solely because of it. Tourists follow its path, unaware of the layers just below. Historians still argue whether its legacy is a triumph of ambition or a warning of unchecked expansion. Maybe it's both. Fringe tidbit? Train conductors used to swap ghost stories at watering stations. Phantom passengers, spectral engineers, spirits who boarded but never got off. You pause by a lonely signal light and almost believe it. You step onto an old rail bridge as the wind rises, carrying echoes. Whispers of workers long gone, of lands cut open, of promises kept and broken. You listen closely and realize the train has never really stopped. It just changed shape. Beneath you, the tracks pulse softly, not just with the weight of trains, but of history. Every spike driven was a heartbeat. Every curve carved into the hills was a decision. Every rail laid was a crossroad. You sit quietly now, the metal cool beneath you.
Your journey started with medieval love, spun through deserts and queens, and landed here, where steel tells stories no monument ever could. And so, as the last stars blink into being above, the rails still whisper, not just about where we've been, but where we're going. They remind you that history doesn't sleep, it travels.
Your breathing slows as the hum of the rails fades into the hush of the night. The stories we followed of guarded glances across medieval feast halls, of ribbon-coated love confessions, of women born into thunder and leading with fire, begin to soften and unravel like fog spilling across quiet valleys. You've crossed ages tonight, wandered kingdoms held together by superstition and silk, galloped with nomads who measured time in migrations, and built across unforgiving terrains with the weight of dreams and iron. It's been loud, it's been wild, and now it's time to let it settle. The air cools around you. You find yourself beside an old mile marker, its numbers worn down by decades of wind and footsteps. Around it, nothing but grass bending gently and stars that refuse to blink. History may rush and roar, but it always leaves behind a quiet, small places where echoes live and where breath can return to its usual rhythm. You wrap these stories around you like a blanket, knowing they won't vanish. They'll curl into your thoughts, surfacing during quiet moments and train whistles in the distance. A courtier's sigh, a warrior queen's vow, a track-laying song, each now part of the soft architecture of your rest. The train fades out, the campfire dwindles. The ribbons and sandal gifts are tucked into drawers only dreams will open again. So sleep well now, Deshana. You've traveled far tonight, and history, like rail, like rhythm, will be here when you return.